Welcome to the Arizona Department of Education's video on the 2015 World and Native Languages Standards. In today's video, we will examine the new standards and look at what proficiency means, as well as performance, and what is the difference between the two. We will also examine and understand performance towards proficiency levels and how they are interconnected. And next, we will examine the three modes of communication, and finally look at what cultural competency standards mean in a classroom. Let's start by examining the 2015 World and Native Language Standards. These were approved and formally adopted in 2015 by the Arizona State Board of Education. The standards are very different in that they are not a grade level based standards. The standards are dependent upon the outcome of the performance of the student. What this means is that a second grader in a Spanish dual language immersion class may have the same standards as a high school student in a Spanish 1-2 class. The standards are written based upon the ability of the student to perform at a particular proficiency level. The next piece of the standards is the performance of the student progressing through different proficiency levels. Most students learning a new language will begin at a novice level, regardless of their grade or age. As they become more familiar and proficient in the target language, they will move up the scale, increasing in proficiency to intermediate, then advanced, and on to superior. Last, the new standards are organized into two categories that are to be taught simultaneously. The first category is communication and includes our three modes of communication: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. We will discuss the particulars of these later on in the video. The next part are the cultural competencies, and they're the second category that should be taught in conjunction with the three modes of communication. Cultural competencies include target language cultures, connections, and comparisons to communities around the globe. Let's look closer now at performance and proficiency. They are not the same and are not interchangeable. Performance. What exactly is it, and what does it look like in the classroom? Performance is practiced language ability within familiar contexts and content areas. It is authentic and includes a real-world use of the language. It is a scaffolded learning of a language with teacher supports to help students practice and then perform at the next level. When assessing student language performance, the assessment should be done in the same communicative manner that the language was learned, practiced, or rehearsed. When in the classroom, teachers should also provide a variety of tasks to apply to their students' language learning in real-world settings. Language use should also be evaluated against descriptive features of a given range of contexts and content areas. While this may provide some indication of proficiency, it does not totally. Now, proficiency. What is it and what does it look like in the classroom? Proficiency is when a student demonstrates what they can do in spontaneous situations. This occurs independent of how language was acquired, and the context may not be familiar. It is unrehearsed, authentic to real-world situations and other native speakers that are unaccustomed to language learners. For proficiency, teacher evaluations are not limited to the content of a particular curriculum that has been taught or learned. It can and should be something out of the norm of the classroom learning. Students must provide evidence of all criteria of a particular level to be rated at that proficiency level. Let's delve into these a little deeper. When you assess performance, you base that performance on your instruction. While this sounds like common sense, it is something that as language teachers we always need to keep in mind. Assess them on what was learned. The performance of our students should be practiced. This familiarity will lower the effective level of the students and increase their ability to become proficient. The content and context you use in your classroom must also be familiar. Make your lessons relevant to your students. You know them best. Use that knowledge to create lessons that are relatable to your kids. And last, performance should be evaluated within a range demonstrating the context and content that your students have learned and practiced. To assess proficiency, it is a little different than assessing performance. To start, proficiency is when your students can use the target language regardless of the situation or how the language was acquired, meaning your students can use the target language beyond the rote memorized or practiced phrases. This also means that students' language ability and use are more spontaneous and non-rehearsed. students using the target language are able to convey ideas in an appropriate context and content level. And last, proficiency requires that at each level, students must demonstrate a consistent pattern of use of all the criteria at all times. If they do not, then they are not operating at that particular proficiency level. Now that we know the difference between performance and proficiency, how do they work together in the classroom? ACTFL has put together an easy-to-use guideline that demonstrates how students learning a language or practicing move from being a novice learner to an intermediate learner to an advanced learner. The more students practice, they will move through proficiency levels. Novice learners will communicate with words and phrases. They can express basic needs and are highly practiced and memorized, and they need a sympathetic listener to understand them. A novice learner might say in the target language, gloves, need gloves, or I need gloves. An intermediate learner communicates with sentences and even connected sentences. They can express and elaborate on basic needs, and they have enough accuracy in the target language to be understood easily by a sympathetic listener. Using our gloves from before, an intermediate listener will say something like, I need winter gloves because my hands are cold. Lastly, an advanced learner can communicate in a variety of time frames and in extended and organized paragraphs. They can respond to and resolve problems, and they also have enough control of the language to interact effectively with people unaccustomed to dealing with language learners. For our glove example, an advanced student might say, if gloves are on sale when I get my next paycheck, I might go get a pair to keep my hands warm. Let's look at our three modes of communication. The first mode of communication we will look at is interpersonal. Interpersonal communication consists of active negotiation of meaning among individuals. Participants observe and monitor one another to see how their meanings and intentions are being communicated. Adjustments and clarifications are made accordingly. Speaking and listening in conversation, and reading and writing include text messages or even social media. Think of interpersonal communication as anything that is done directly one-on-one or in a group. Person to person is another way to think of interpersonal communication. Our next mode of communication is interpretive. This mode of communication also consists of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. However, it is done in a more individual manner. Interpretive communication consists of interpretation of what the author, speaker, or producer wants the receiver of the message to understand. It is a one-way communication with no recourse to the active negotiation of meaning with the writer, speaker, or producer. Interpretation differs from comprehension and translation in that interpretation implies the ability to read, listen, or view between the lines, including understanding from within the cultural mindset or perspective. Reading things like website stories and articles, listening to speeches, messages, songs, or viewing video clips of authentic materials is all a great way to bring interpretive communication into your classroom. Again, remember, think of interpretive communication as one way. Our last mode of communication is presentational. Like interpretive, presentational is also a one-way form of communication. However, it also consists of the creation of messages to inform, explain, persuade, or narrate. It is that one-way communication that's intended to facilitate interpretation by members of the other culture where no direct opportunity for active negotiation of meaning between members of the two cultures exists. To ensure the intended audience is successful in its interpretation, the presenter needs knowledge of the audience's language and culture. Writing messages, articles, reports, or speaking like you're telling a story, giving a speech, or describing a poster, or visually representing a video or PowerPoint are all examples of presentational communication you can find in your classrooms. Again, remember, presentational communication is produced. It's one way, it's drafted and edited communication to an individual, a group of people, or some other audience. In addition to using the three modes of communication in your teaching, you must also include standards that address the teaching of cultural competencies. But what exactly does that mean? In the case of teaching languages, it means using the target language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the relationship between the practices, products, and perspectives of the culture studies. It means taking the time to find authentic resources to use in your classroom to enable your students to develop insights into a culture that they are not available to in any other way. These cultural competencies also teach students to be more culturally aware of others and avoid cultural appropriation, as well as giving them a deeper insight into their own culture as they can compare the two. Keep in mind that teaching culture is not something that is done separately. It is done in conjunction with language learning. It does not come from a textbook, nor is it to be done once a week like Culture Mondays. The last cultural component to the Arizona World and Native Language Standards is the idea that we use cultural competencies to build, reinforce, and expand knowledge of other content areas and evaluate information and diverse perspectives while using the target language to develop critical thinking and creative problem solving. So what does this mean and what does it look like in your classroom? What this means is that you are now the best friend of core subject teachers. Use the target language to teach history lessons that need to be reinforced. Use the target language to teach about biology or climate of an area where the target language is spoken and compare that to where your students live. Use the music and art of the target language speaking countries to introduce your students to new sights and sounds they are unfamiliar with. This exchange of cultural information in the target language will bring a greater depth of understanding of all topics and enhance your students' learning of the language. Thank you for watching our brief overview on the Arizona State World and Native Language Standards. Check out some of our additional resources like our monthly newsletter and free online resources on our website. For questions or concerns, please contact either Tammy Waller at tammy.waller@azed.gov or Linda Burrows at linda.burrows@azed.gov or visit the Arizona Department of Education's World and Native Languages website. Thank you.